Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What has been your most bone-chilling, hair-raising, let's get the hell out of here experience? Story 1. Faceless Figure.
It was late October, and a group of college friends decided to spend the weekend at a cabin deep in the woods. The cabin was old, practically ancient, and rumors of its haunted past only added to its allure. They laughed off the legends, dismissing them as just another spooky campfire tale. On the second night, after an evening of storytelling, the group decided to explore the surrounding forest. The air was crisp and cold, the moonlight filtering through the skeletal trees. Suddenly, one of the friends spotted a faint glow ahead. It looked like a lantern swaying gently, as if someone was guiding them deeper into the woods. Intrigued, they decided to follow it. The glow led them to an abandoned cemetery, shrouded in fog. At the center was a crumbling mausoleum. As they approached, they heard faint whispers, unintelligible but undeniably human. The lantern's glow disappeared, leaving them in near total darkness. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and echoing from behind the mausoleum. A tall, shadowy figure emerged, wearing a tattered long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. It had no face, just an endless void where eyes and features should have been. It raised one skeletal hand and pointed at them. Panic set in, and they bolted back toward the cabin. No matter how fast they ran, the footsteps seemed to stay right behind them. When they finally reached the cabin and slammed the door shut, the lantern light reappeared outside the window, hovering just out of reach. For hours they huddled together, watching the glow circle the cabin. The whispers never stopped, growing louder and louder until, just before dawn, everything fell silent. When they finally dared to look outside, the lantern and the shadow were gone, but faint footprints circled the cabin in the dirt. They left that morning, never speaking of the incident again. But every Halloween since, at least one of them claims to see a faint light glowing in the distance, no matter where they are.
Story 2. Sleep Paralysis Nightmare.
It was my sophomore year in college, and I had just moved into a small apartment close to campus. The building was old, with creaky floors and a constant draft that made it feel colder than it should have been. My first night there, I shrugged it off as part of the charm, but I soon realized the place had something far from charming about it. Around 3 a.m., I woke up, paralyzed. I had experienced sleep paralysis before, but this was different. I could see my entire room perfectly, the faint light from the street lamp casting eerie shadows across the walls. Suddenly, the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, like they were alive. In the corner of the room stood a figure, completely cloaked in darkness. It was tall, with elongated limbs and a head that seemed slightly tilted, as though it were observing me. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. As I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, it began to move. Slowly, it approached my bed, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was being controlled by invisible strings. My chest tightened as it loomed over me, its face void of features, just an endless blackness. Then, I heard it, a low, raspy whisper. Though the words were unintelligible, the sound was filled with malice. Just when I thought it could not get worse, the figure leaned closer, its shadowy face inches from mine. My heart raced as I felt a cold breath against my cheek. Suddenly, it spoke, clear and deliberate this time. "You should not be here." In an instant, I was released from the paralysis. I bolted upright, gasping for air, and turned on every light in the room. The figure was gone, but the oppressive cold and faint smell of decay lingered. I moved out 2 weeks later, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The landlord casually mentioned that the apartment had been vacant for years after a previous tenant had mysteriously disappeared. Even now, I sometimes wake up to the same rasping whispers in the dead of night, no matter where I live.
Story 3. Reflections of Terror.
It was a small vintage shop tucked into a forgotten corner of town where I found it, the antique mirror. The ornate frame, gilded and adorned with intricate carvings, looked like something out of another century. The shopkeeper warned me, "This piece has a history. Be careful where you place it." I brushed off her comment as a sales pitch and bought it anyway. That night I hung the mirror in my bedroom. At first it seemed ordinary, just another decorative piece to add some charm to my otherwise plain room. But as the hours wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. Around midnight, I awoke to a soft tapping sound. My eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight streaming through the window, and my gaze was drawn to the mirror. At first, it appeared normal, reflecting the room exactly as it should. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing in the reflection, a woman. She was wearing a tattered white dress, her hair hanging in dark, wet strands that obscured most of her face. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her arms hung limply at her sides. She was not in the room, only in the reflection. I froze, unable to look away as the woman slowly turned her head toward me, revealing empty, blackened eye sockets. Her lips curled into a sinister grin. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow, anything but what it appeared to be. Suddenly, she raised her hand and pointed directly at me. The tapping sound started again, louder this time, coming from inside the mirror. Then, as if the glass were water, her hand began to push through it. I leaped out of bed and ran to turn on the lights, but the moment the room was illuminated, she was gone. The mirror reflected only my terrified face and the disheveled room behind me. I smashed the mirror the next morning, but fragments of it still haunt me. Sometimes in reflective surfaces, windows, puddles, even my phone screen, I catch a glimpse of her. And each time she is closer than before.
Story 4. Whispers from the Walls.
I moved into an old apartment on the edge of town, a place that seemed to have seen better days. The rent was cheap, and I didn't mind the creaking floors or the faint smell of mildew that lingered in the air. It was a temporary place, I thought. Just somewhere to stay while I figured out my next move. It wasn't long before I started hearing the noises. At first, it was easy to dismiss a faint scratching like a mouse or something small scurrying in the walls. But then it got louder, more persistent. Sometimes it sounded like someone was tapping on the walls just out of reach, just enough to make me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the building settling. But one night, the tapping turned into whispers, faint at first, barely audible, like a distant conversation. "Help, help." The words drifted through the walls, but they didn't sound like a voice. It was more like a low hum, something that echoed deep within the structure. I couldn't sleep. The whispers became clearer, and they weren't asking for help. They were calling my name. I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I pressed my ear to the wall and listened closely. My heart raced as the whispers grew louder, as if someone was standing just on the other side. I could make out my name, then a strange phrase, "Come closer." I backed away, panic surging through me, but something inside me told me to go deeper, into the wall itself. I pried at the peeling wallpaper, revealing a small crack in the plaster. A chill ran through me as I realized the space behind the wall was hollow, an entire section of the apartment that wasn't meant to be there. With trembling hands, I pulled away the plaster. What I found made my stomach drop. A narrow passageway led deeper into the building, its walls coated in grime, and the air was thick with an oppressive, musty scent. The whispers were louder now, almost frantic. "Come closer," they urged again. I took one hesitant step into the passageway, but before I could move further, the whispers stopped. Dead silence. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway, shrouded in shadow but unmistakably human. In an instant I turned and ran, slamming the passageway shut. That night, I moved out of the apartment, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that something was still in those walls waiting.
Story 5. Generation of Nightmares.
The Ashford family had lived in their ancestral home for generations, each generation unknowingly cursed by the dark pact made by their great-great-grandfather. No one ever spoke of it, but it was whispered among the elders, those who still remembered the chilling tales. The curse was born of black magic, a pact sealed with blood, born of greed and ambition. It started when Thomas Ashford, the patriarch of the family, became obsessed with immortality. He sought the aid of a mysterious woman who was rumored to be a witch. Desperate, he agreed to perform a dark ritual that would ensure his family's legacy never faded, a ritual that would bind the Ashford bloodline to the spirit of an ancient demon. He was promised that the Ashford name would live forever, that each generation would thrive without fear of poverty or sickness. But there was a cost. Each generation would be haunted by the spirit of the demon, bound to the family through nightmares, and plagued by misfortune if they failed to honor the pact. For years, Thomas lived in peace, his family prospering, but the curse began to show its ugly head in the most subtle ways. Family members began to experience horrifying nightmares, visions of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their rooms, whispers calling their names, and terrible images of death and destruction. At first it seemed like the product of overactive imaginations, but then it began to escalate. Every night, without fail, one family member would wake up in a cold sweat, screaming from the depths of their soul. The following day, they would speak of the same nightmare, the shadowy figure of Thomas Ashford, now a decayed version of himself, roaming the halls of the house, his eyes empty, searching for the next victim. And the victims were always the next generation, always the youngest child in the family. As the generations passed, the curse became more intense. The Ashfords began to die under mysterious circumstances, their deaths always linked to the nightmares that tormented them in their sleep. No one ever survived long enough to break the cycle. I moved into the Ashford estate as a distant relative, unaware of the legacy that awaited me. It wasn't long before the dreams started. Every night, I could feel the presence of something watching me, waiting. In the dream, I would stand before the decayed figure of Thomas Ashford, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. "You are next," he would whisper. One night, the dream stopped, but when I awoke, I saw the shadowy figure standing in my doorway.
Story 6. Woman in the White Cloth.
It was a quiet evening when Emily and her friends decided to camp out in the woods near their town. The full moon illuminated the sky, casting eerie shadows among the trees. The group gathered around a campfire, sharing stories and laughing as the warmth from the fire kept the chilling air at bay. But the peace of the night was soon shattered. As they settled in, Emily noticed something strange. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure in the distance. A tall, dark silhouette stood between two ancient trees. The figure was a woman, but something was off. She wore an unsettling, pure white cloth that flowed around her as if there was no wind. Her long hair was dark as night, and her face was hidden in shadow, but Emily could feel her eyes watching them. The woman stood still, just outside the glow of their campfire, as if observing them. Emily tried to shake off the feeling of unease but couldn't. The others continued to laugh, unaware of the looming presence. Then, as Emily turned back toward the fire, she heard it, a chilling, high-pitched laugh. It came from the figure in the distance. Emily's heart raced as the laughter grew louder, more unsettling. It wasn't just a laugh, it felt like a voice from deep within the earth, sinister and ancient. The woman started to move, gliding silently through the trees, and each step she took, the laughter grew more frantic, more mocking. Suddenly, the woman emerged from behind a tree, her figure almost floating toward them. Her face remained hidden, but the eerie laugh echoed all around. Emily could feel the hair on her neck stand up as the woman in white stopped at the edge of the firelight. Without warning, she raised her head, revealing her face, a face completely void of any features, just pale, lifeless skin. The laughter stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The woman in white raised one hand and pointed directly at Emily. The next moment, Emily found herself running through the woods, her friends calling her name, but she never looked back. No one ever saw her again.
Story 7. Blood Demands.
For generations, the village of Stonybrook had lived in the shadow of a dark legend. Deep in the forest that bordered their home stood an ancient stone altar, rumored to be the site of countless sacrifices. The villagers spoke of a powerful entity, a dark force that demanded blood in exchange for protection from misfortune. It was known only as the Hunger. Over the years, the entity's demands grew. Those who defied it faced unspeakable horrors. It would begin with strange occurrences, animals would go missing, and crops would wither overnight. But the real terror began when it set its eyes on the defiant ones. The first victim was a young farmer named Thomas. He had heard the whispers but dismissed them as superstitions. One cold autumn evening, he received a visit from the elders of the village, all of them trembling. They told him that the Hunger had sent its warning: sacrifice an animal to satisfy its thirst for blood or face the consequences. Thomas, filled with disbelief, refused. The next night, his prized cattle began to scream in the barn. When he arrived, he found their bodies mangled, their blood drained, but that was only the beginning. Soon after, Thomas began to experience terrible nightmares. Each night, the Hunger appeared in his dreams, an immense shadow with glowing red eyes demanding blood. It would whisper dark promises of torment if he didn't comply. His body was marked with strange crimson symbols that no one could explain. The next morning, he found his wife, Sarah, lying lifeless in their bed, her blood drained, just like the cattle. Desperate, Thomas fled into the forest to seek refuge, but the Hunger was relentless. As he ventured deeper, the forest seemed to twist around him, leading him to the altar. In the dead of night, as he knelt before the altar, a terrible guttural voice echoed through the trees. "You defied me, now you will pay." The ground beneath him cracked open, and dark tendrils reached up, pulling him into the earth. He screamed as his body was torn apart. His blood spilled into the soil as an offering to the entity that had demanded it. Years passed, and the village continued to honor the Hunger, offering blood to spare their lives. No one dared defy it, for they all knew the terrible fate that awaited those who did.
Story 8. Terror of Room 204.
It was a chilly November evening, and my friends and I were on a road trip through the countryside. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we found ourselves lost, miles away from any town. With no other options, we decided to stop for the night at a rundown roadside inn we stumbled upon. The innkeeper was a frail old man who spoke little and handed us the keys to room 204 without a word. The room itself was unsettling, dimly lit with peeling wallpaper and a heavy, musty smell that made it hard to breathe. The centerpiece of the room was an old mirror, cracked at the edges, mounted on the wall opposite the beds. Something about the mirror felt. It seemed too reflective, too sharp, and no matter where you stood, you felt like it was watching you. As the night wore on, the strange occurrences began. At first, we heard faint scratching noises, like fingernails dragging along wood. We brushed it off as rats. Then, the mirror started to fog up, even though the room was cold. What made it worse was the faint outline of handprints that appeared on the glass, on the inside. Terrified but trying to remain rational, one of my friends, Mike, decided to cover the mirror with a blanket. "There, problem solved," he said with a nervous laugh. But just as he stepped back, we heard a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from behind the mirror. "You should not be here." The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. My heart pounded as I felt something cold brush past me. When the lights returned, the blanket was on the floor, and the mirror was cracked further, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Panicking, we decided to leave immediately. As we packed, the door slammed shut, and the scratching noise turned into pounding, as though something was trying to break through the walls. In the mirror, we saw it, a pale, eyeless figure with elongated limbs and a wide, unnatural grin, watching us intently. We sprinted out of the room, abandoning our bags. When we reached the front desk to scream for help, the innkeeper was gone, and the building itself looked older, abandoned, as if no one had been there for decades. To this day, I cannot explain what happened in room 204, but I know one thing: I will never stay in an unknown inn again.
Story 9. Eyes in the Dark.
It was a cold, moonless night when I decided to take a shortcut home through an old dirt road that cut across the countryside. The road was infamous for its eerie reputation, with tales of strange sightings and unexplainable events whispered by the locals. I dismissed the warnings as superstitious nonsense until that night. The air was unnervingly still as I walked, the crunch of my boots on gravel the only sound. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the crossroads up ahead. It was tall and cloaked in shadows, with no discernible features except for glowing, amber-like eyes that pierced the darkness. At first, I thought it was a prank, maybe a scarecrow someone set up to spook travelers. But as I approached, the figure moved, tilting its head in a disturbingly slow, unnatural motion. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but my curiosity betrayed me, and I kept walking, my breath shallow and quick. When I was just a few feet away, the figure raised an arm and pointed to the left fork of the road. Its long, gnarled fingers seemed to beckon, though no words were spoken. Against all reason, I took the right path instead, my heart pounding. That was when the laughter began. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves, but it grew louder, echoing all around me. The figure was suddenly behind me, no footsteps or warning, just there. It whispered, "You chose wrong." The next moments were a blur of terror. The air grew icy, and the laughter turned into deafening screams. Shadows lunged at me from every direction, clawing and pulling as I ran blindly, desperate to escape. I do not know how I made it home that night, but the experience left me shaken. To this day, I avoid crossroads after dark, haunted by the memory of those glowing eyes and the chilling words that still echo in my nightmares.
Story 10. Ghost in the Corridor.
It was late autumn when my cousin Emily inherited Ashwood Manor, a sprawling but dilapidated estate hidden deep in the countryside. The house was infamous for its dark history, a tale of a heartbroken widow who vanished one stormy night and was never seen again. As curious as I was apprehensive, I agreed to stay with Emily for the weekend to help her sort through the old belongings left behind. The first night was quiet, save for the creaks and groans of the old house settling in the wind. On the second night, however, everything changed. Emily and I were sifting through a trunk in the attic when a loud thud echoed from downstairs. We froze, exchanging uneasy glances. "Probably the wind," Emily muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. We descended the stairs cautiously, and that was when we noticed the chill. a bone-deep cold that seemed to drain the warmth from our very cores. The grand mirror in the hall was fogged over, and on its surface faint handprints appeared. Then we saw her. Standing at the end of the corridor was a ghostly figure draped in tattered, translucent black veils. Her face was pale and hollow, with empty sockets where her eyes should have been. Long, claw-like fingers extended from her hands, and her head tilted unnaturally to one side, as if her neck had been broken. She swayed slightly, her movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette on tangled strings. She opened her mouth, but no words came out, only a guttural, otherworldly wail that made my blood turn to ice. Slowly she began to move toward us, her feet never quite touching the ground. The walls around us seemed to warp, closing in, and shadows danced wildly as if alive. We bolted back to the attic, slamming the door behind us. The wailing grew louder, followed by scratching on the other side of the door, then silence. When dawn broke, we left Ashwood Manor and never returned. To this day, I can still hear that wail in my nightmares, and I know, deep down, she is still waiting.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below, and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares, and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight, and remember, not all shadows are empty.